Luke Gygax is the son of Gary Gygax, who made D&D. So I sat down with him to talk to him about Gary Con, what it was like growing up in that house when D&D was being created, and also what it feels like to have something his father built have such an amazing cultural impact.
Why did you start GaryCon?
Well, GaryCon is a memorial convention for my father, Gary Gygax, who created Dungeons and Dragons, and he passed away in March 4th of 2008. And the outpouring from across the world, people who reached out to us on email or forum posts or even phone calls, just to tell us how much my dad meant to them and how his passing impacted them, was amazing. And so even this very sad time, this very difficult time, we knew that just a small funeral service would be difficult, and other people were physically, some were moved enough to physically come to Lake Geneva to celebrate with us. So we thought, well, what's the best way to do that is to do what my dad loved so much in life, is to play games. So we rented out the American Legion Hall, which was the site of some old conventions, whether it was a winter fantasy or something like that, or even old Gen Cons. And we got together and we played Dungeons and Dragons and Empire Builder and Rail Baron and all of his favorite games. And we had a podium and people could share their favorite story about my dad. And we had some food and some drink. And we got together and it was a wonderful remembrance to honor him. And someone said, this was a great way to celebrate your dad's life. Why don't we do it again next year? And so I said, okay. And my family and I, my brothers and sisters, came together and we said, we'll do GaryCon. And it just was going to be a one-day, game day, gathering. And 168 people showed up. So, and there was no planned events or anything. We'd made some T-shirts and that's about it. And we all got together and played games, and it grew from there. And we're up to over, I guess, probably over 2,500 this year.
That's insane.
Yeah, and it's just, believe me, it's in the middle of Lake Geneva. It's at the Grand Geneva Resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in March.
Which is a lovely place.
It is.
I was not prepared for how lovely it was going to be.
Oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful location, but it's also March in Wisconsin, so it might be 60 degrees or it might be 8 degrees.
Right.
Like we were offloading a truck and it was 8 degrees. That's bitterly cold, and I'm used to California these days, so I was less than pleased about that. But Lake Geneva is an hour and 15 minutes from the Milwaukee airport and about an hour and 45 minutes from O'Hare. So if you want to come to GaryCon, you really want to be here. And I think that says something about the folks who are here, and that they're very devoted and they want to be here and they came here to have a good time and to celebrate Dungeons and Dragons and my dad's works. And so it gives a very close-knit feel and a lot of camaraderie. I think the environment had something to do with the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. My dad's hometown was Lake Geneva. It's where he grew up from the age of 8 onward. And it has 4 seasons, and in the wintertime it's cold. And so a lot of you tend to do more indoor activities then. So he loved to read. He read all sorts of science fiction and fantasy, and his father told him wonderful stories of, wizards casting spells and invisible rings and cloaks with magical powers and things like that. So he had an interest in it from a very young age. And also here in town, he would find reasons to, it's kind of a small town, so it's pretty quiet. But he had a sense of adventure, so he would go to the abandoned sanitarium that was here that had, it was all fenced off and you weren't supposed to go in there, but people would break in and had stripped the pipes out to salvage them, and was dilapidated, so you might have to climb, the doors are locked, you might have to climb up the wall, slip into a window, and be careful, here's a hole in the floor that you could fall through, or there's a way to crawl into the basement. So he did lots of exploring through there, and with a vivid imagination as a young person, those became places where there's monsters and that sort of thing, and he was bravely adventuring through them. And there really were vagrants and that sort of stuff in there too, so you actually really have to duck and stay away from them. But yeah, I think this place fed his imagination, and those sorts of experiences helped shape him. And then the long, cold winters, he got exposed to playing board games and war games and miniatures, and his love of fantasy mixed with a desire to do some of the medieval combat besides just Napoleonics or other genres of miniatures, historical miniatures wargaming. And with him and seeing what Dave Arneson was doing with Blackmore, sort of a Bronstein, a medieval Bronstein, and his chainmail and his interest in the Castles and Crusade Society stuff came together, and his vivid imagination and all those writings, things that he'd read, and the chainmail fantasy supplement kind of gelled together, and he became very excited and gave launch to Dungeons and Dragons, which was published in 1974, but really kind of started in maybe 72 and was written in 73. It just took him some time to get the money together and try to get Dungeons and Dragons out the door.
Yeah, and it almost didn't happen, right? Like,
oh, yes.
Was it hard getting D&D created?
Absolutely. So he had this idea, and it was even the fantasy supplement in Chainmail was kind of scoffed at by a lot of serious wargamers who were like, well, that's not a historically accurate. Obviously, there's no ogres. Why are there spells? This is children's stuff. And so, but a few people embraced it and enjoyed it. But it was very difficult. He took the game. He was very excited and very passionate. This is going to be huge. It could sell 10,000 copies. It's that big of a game. And so he took it to Avalon Hill, and they said, no, this is kind of a frivolous game that's never going to sell. And then he went to the second biggest company, which is also very tiny in this cottage industry, called Guidon Games. And Don Lowry said, yeah, you know what, Gary, we're not interested. That's not going to be successful. But he believed enough that he convinced his best friend, Don Kay, to take his vacation fund, which was $1,000. Previously, I thought it was a loan against a life insurance, but my brother Ernie, who was a little older, he said, no, it was his vacation fund, and he got in a lot of trouble with his wife for doing that. They took $1,000 as seed money, and they formed Tactical Studies Rules, which is what TSR had stood for initially, and they published a game called Cavaliers and Roundheads because that was one booklet, and they didn't have enough money to make the 3 booklets required for Dungeons and Dragons. They couldn't pay the printing costs. So with the success of Cavaliers and Roundheads and a little bit of additional outside investment from a guy named, I think it was Melvin Bloom or maybe Brian Bloom, they published Dungeons and Dragons in, I think it was January of 1974, and this little idea got off the ground. But it was by no means was this a sure thing. To complicate all this, and why did my dad need help doing it? He was a shoe repairman. He repaired shoes in the basement of our home and wrote. So this was his desire. He wanted to create games. And he did board games and such, but that wasn't a big payer. He had 5 children. We were extremely poor on food stamps, and my mother would garden for subsistence. She canned food and baked her own bread and all that just to feed the family. My brother, we'd get 1 pair of shoes a year. If they wore out, we had to put cardboard in them. I wore hand-me-down winter boots for my sister with a sandwich, the bread bag in them. We were basically desperately poor, and yet my dad believed enough in this that he, put everything on the line, and he gambled, and it happened to pay off. And so thus we have Dungeons and Dragons.
What was that like for the family, seeing that take off?
Oh yeah, that was quite a transition. Because like I said, we would eat, meals were difficult for us. We'd eat oatmeal in the morning or generic, puffed rice in a plastic bag, not even the box cereal. And we'd only be able to eat at meal times, and sometimes there wasn't a lot of food. And my mom didn't have a car. My dad never drove, but my mom didn't have a driver's license or a car either because we couldn't afford one. So I remember she bought a car, and that was a big deal. So at 40, she got her driver's license and we had a green station wagon called the Green Slime. We nicknamed it. She called it the Jade Jewel, but we called it the Green Slime because it was, a wood paneled green station wagon.
That's funny. Then, we had a old rundown green caddy called the Pea Green Machine that was always falling apart.
Yeah.
Sorry. Continue.
Yeah. No. Same kind of thing. And then we bought a house. My dad bought a house because we were renting 330 Center Street. We just rented that home. And so he bought his first home out on Chapin Road, and at about that time, we could afford things. When we went to the grocery store, my mom would say yes. When we'd say, "Can we buy that?" She was like, "Yes, you can." We're like, "No way." We'd pick out like brand name cereal, like Cookie Crisp or Captain Crunch. That was a pretty big deal. So, and money became a little bit less of a problem. So that was pretty neat. I was young, 7 years old or so, 6, 7 years old. But yes, for my brothers and sisters, I'm sure that was also very important because when you're older and you're poor, you probably get picked on a lot more, for not having the fashionable things and all that sort of stuff.
What's the most impactful thing to you personally out of what is happening now?
Yeah. We're seeing an explosion in Dungeons and Dragons, the popular resurgence of the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons, and I think it's very validating that my dad's work is still important and it still has impact. And honestly, I knew he was an important game designer, and I knew he did things that many people enjoyed, and a wonderful recreational device. But really, when he passed away, it really dawned on me with people, all the questions and the testimonials and people pouring out how it had impacted their lives positively. Whether it was they'd had a learning disability and these were so cool, and they saw the artwork on the outside, and they saw people playing. They're like, I have to learn how to do this, and it gave them that motivation to learn to overcome that disability. And now they're avid readers, and they're, maybe they became a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is, and they've discovered this a wonderful world through Dungeons and Dragons, or helping people escape from very painful situations, whether it be the loss of a parent, perhaps as a child, or a difficult environment that they were raised in with potentially alcoholic parents, or whatever that may be, whatever those chances may be. It gave them an escape and a positive outlet, as opposed to turning into something negative, alcohol, drug use, or criminal activities, stuff like that, getting in a gang. So all those things. Then that's when it began to dawn on me. And I also thought, well, look at pop culture, look at video games. All the architecture for video games, or not all, but much of the architecture, especially for role-playing video games, is drawn from Dungeons and Dragons. Think about the concepts of hit points, armor class, leveling up. The whole role-playing game genre didn't exist until Dungeons and Dragons. Prior to Dungeons and Dragons, you were sitting at a board, so you had a physical confines of what the game was. You had a beginning and an end, and you had an adversarial relationship with other people playing the game. You were opponents. Somebody was a winner and somebody was a loser. Well, Dungeons and Dragons, changed all of that, and now you have a story, a game with a beginning but no set end. You can go anywhere you want. You can take any action that you want to do, and the Dungeon Master is there. The word Dungeon Master didn't exist. The referee was there to determine what was going on. They would set this story in front of you, but it was completely open-ended, and nobody was a loser. You might get killed, but you could start another character and continue your adventures. And most of the times, it carried on from session to set. That's another thing. You gained experience and went up levels, and this character grew with you, and it was very immersive. So all these things are revolutionary, and we take them for granted now. It's like we just assume, like, oh yeah, this is how it is. But it wasn't that way. So this is amazing. It's akin to something like jazz music is an American art form. Well, role-playing gaming, that's a uniquely American thing that's created. And sure, I am the son of Gary Gygax, so I probably have some bias to this, but I think there is substantial evidence to say this person influenced our popular culture greatly, and I'm very proud of that. So I love to see this resurgence of Dungeons and Dragons and people discovering the joy of role-playing and its roots in my father's work. And it's cool. I think that our technology has gotten to a point where Dungeons and Dragons is demystified now, and it's a couple generations in, and our media is no longer cowboys and Indians so much as fantastic adventures, whether it's something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's still fantasy, right? But certainly Game of Thrones, Harry Potter books. Every kid reads Harry Potter books these days. And those are extremely popular. And then tons and tons of movies and books and everything that has just permeated the society. Most of those folks, if not all, were playing Dungeons and Dragons as kids, and that's where they discovered their desire to be creators and learned that art form at a young age through Dungeons and Dragons and dungeon mastering.
What do you personally want your legacy to be?
That's an excellent question, and I guess it's something I hadn't thought about extensively. I mean, I guess I've put just about 30 years in the military, And that's a incredible legacy. My grandfather was retired as a colonel in the Air Force, and so that's a good legacy to leave behind. I suppose I really enjoy carrying the mantle forward of my dad's work. I would like to do well, obviously establishing Gary Con as a living memorial to honor my father, and to extend that to include the the other folks who were there in the early days, establishing the groundwork for the hobby. I think that's been something that I've wanted to do, and to also make sure that my father is not forgotten as the cultural icon that he is, or was, I guess, at this point. I believe he is a cultural icon and deserves to be recognized for those accomplishments. So I think that is something that I want to spearhead and make sure that that happens, if at all possible. And one of those things is through this very cathartic and wonderful gathering that we call Gary Con every year in this little small town of Lake Geneva. But I would like to see him recognized in bigger ways. I think there's his story is amazing, the story of my family, and he was a very humble beginnings, and then he created this game and rose up, and there's this whole story. He lost everything as well. So he lost Dungeons and Dragons. He lost the company TSR through hostile stock takeover. And there's a great book, if anyone wants to read it, Empire of Imagination, that'll kind of quickly take you through there, and it is very digestible. And then he found himself again and created games all the way on. But there's a lot of triumph and tragedy in that story, and it's inspirational, I think, in some ways. And there's lessons to be drawn. It's identifiable. And for me, I would like to create content as well. Once I retire from the military, I would like to dust off, bring some of my modules out and create new content. And whether I do content through streaming or YouTube or simply PDF, written word. I think I'd like to be able to do that and go to more conventions and play with more gamers and talk to more people and do this thing that I've loved doing since I was about 4 years old.
We have a group of players who play D&D as friends, who started streaming it. It became insanely popular, and now there's a Kickstarter for a new D&D animated series, basically, called Critical Role.
Yeah.
Like the Legend of Vox Machina.
Yep.
What is that like right now at this moment? This would not be happening if it wasn't for your father inventing this.
It is. It's certainly. I mean, I think he'd be blown away if he were alive today and to see something. It's really amazing, and it just goes to show that this idea, what he tapped into is. I think it's a long-lasting. It's something that's in our DNA. This storytelling, and I suppose it's like the difference. You read a novel, and you insert yourself into. Usually, you read books and you try to identify with the character, the main character, the protagonist, but you don't get to make any of the choices. You're just following along. In Dungeons and Dragons, you get to be the protagonist. You get to be the main character, and you're making those decisions. You're given the surroundings around there. I just think it's awesome, and that appeals to people. Everyone wants to be a hero, right? Isn't that what it's about?